La siguiente presentación, titulada Long-Term Preservation of Digital Scholarly Publication, estará a cargo de Craig Van Dyke. Craig es director ejecutivo de Clocks. Antes de trabajar en Clocks, Craig Van Dyke ocupó un cargo de vicepresidente de contenidos en la editorial Wiley. Asimismo, ha desarrollado una carrera de preservación digital, siendo parte de la junta directiva de la Fundación Internacional de DOI, Clocks, OrgID, Crossref y la Sociedad de Edición Académica SP por sus siglas en inglés, además de ser parte del Comité Consultivo de Pórtico. Recuerden que durante esta presentación pueden hacer clic sobre la traducción, sobre el icono traducción, para poder configurar el idioma de su preferencia. También comentarles que esto estará transmitido a través del canal de YouTube. Por último, también les queremos hacer transmitir que pueden hacer llegar sus preguntas, sus consultas a través del chat, a través de Twitter con el hashtag BiblioU2021. Craig, desde ya muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos durante esta jornada. Te dejamos la palabra para que puedas comenzar tu presentación.
Gracias, Tanya. Hola, and gracias, Barbara Rivera, for inviting me. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak with so many people in Latin America today. It's a very successful conference, so congratulations to everybody. I am Craig Van Dyke. I'm the head of the Clocks Archive, and I am now going to share my screen. Okay, I believe that I am now sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see my first slide. So again, thanks everyone. The first half of my talk will be about digital preservation of scholarly literature more generally. The second half of my talk will be about clocks more specifically. And by the way, I'm aware that the audio quality of my voice is probably not perfect. So I apologize for that, but I'm afraid it will be the best I can do. So I will just go forward and I will try to speak slowly and clearly. So the concept of digital preservation began really when libraries and users began using digital copies as the primary resource. With print, many copies exist in many different libraries around the world. So we can all feel comfortable that print versions are preserved because there's many copies all around the world. However, with digital content, normally the libraries do not have a digital copy. Sometimes they do, but normally not. The users are accessing the content on the publisher's platform. So how can libraries and users be sure that digital content will not disappear? And I would add here that libraries have always been the champions of preservation. And everyone has assumed that libraries were taking care of preservation in the print world. In the digital world, we need what we call trusted third parties like Clocks to step in and make sure that the content is preserved for the long term. Scholars rely upon...
So sorry for interrupting, but can you change the wave for the presentation, please?
Oh, right, it should be on...
yeah, all good, sorry, thank you.
Sorry about that, I completely forgot. Okay. All right, thank you for that reminder. So scholars rely upon ongoing access to content. And scholarly literature is valuable for a long time. However, digital content can disappear from the web. And that's a problem for scholars because scholars need to be able to go back to the content that they have previously accessed and be able to access it again. CLOCKS is a system that ensures that the content will continue to be available. I want to talk in particular about open access journals today because open access journals have become more and more important and seem to be maybe becoming the primary kind of journal in the future. And I know that in Latin America, there have been a lot of new open access journals that have started in the last several years. Open access lowers the barriers to entry for publishers. Now we have a lot of very small open access publishers. And I put publishers in quotation marks because oftentimes these people do not really consider themselves publishers. They might be more researchers who have started a journal. And often these small journals lack financial resources, also technical resources, human resources, and organizational resources. And for these reasons, these journals can be at risk of disappearing. In September of 2020, a preprint was published called Open is Not Forever. And I give you the URL here. And this preprint points out that many open access journals have disappeared from the web. And that is a problem, and it is something that CLOCKS is concerned about. And I'll speak a little bit later about the new project. Since I'm talking about open access journals, I should also mention predatory journals. These are journals, open access journals, that are basically a scam, just trying to get authors money. They tell the authors, you know, we will publish your paper, it will be peer reviewed, et cetera. But they often just take the money and don't deliver on those promises. I don't think that Latin America has a lot of predatory open access publishers. We have seen predatory publishers in other parts of the world. In the CLOCKS system, we have many open access journals. Of course, we also have many subscription journals. And I want to talk a little bit about the Open Journal System, OJS. Many open access journals use OJS, and OJS is a good system. And in fact, OJS provides a pathway to preservation that has no cost to the publisher. And it is called the Public Knowledge Project Preservation Network, or PKP-PN. And for any publisher that is using OJS, CLOCKS actually recommends that they should join the PKP-PN. It is a good system. In fact, it uses the same underlying technology that CLOCKS uses, which is the CLOCKS software. Before going any further, I want to mention as a kind of side note, I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with Sciello. Sciello was in the CLOCKS system for 3 years. And I've recently been back in touch with Sciello, and I believe they are working on their own preservation solution. But I can't talk in any more detail. So I want to mention a new project for open access journal preservation. The project has 5 partners: the Directory of Open Access Journals, or DOAJ, CLOCKS, Public Knowledge Project, who is the host of the OJS system, the Internet Archive, and the Keepers Registry, which is part of international. These 5 partners have come together with the goal of increasing the preservation coverage of open access journals. Phase 1 will focus on diamond OA journals. These are journals with no author fees, and typically they have no revenue. They are supported by a university. The aim of the project is to offer a preservation solution that is at lower cost so that more open access journals can be preserved. A requirement for the project is that the journal should be listed in the DOAJ. So there are a few challenges for digital preservation. One is costs. You know, it does cost something to preserve the content over the long term. There's storage costs, there's operational costs, organizational costs, communications costs. And trying to limit those costs is, of course, important. Communications are also sometimes a challenge. There are publishers all over the world, and this sort of gets into standard practices. In journal publishing, there are a lot of standard practices, which is very helpful, but not all journals follow the standard practices, preparing appropriate metadata, for example, using digital object identifiers. And there's also a requirement for technical capabilities. The publisher needs to have some level of technical capability in order to preserve their content for the long term. So what does successful digital preservation look like? Well, the first point I want to make is that preservation is more than archiving. Making a backup copy is not preservation. Preservation requires active management to ensure that the content data is healthy. I will talk about that a little bit later. I do want to mention that there are several preservation services that I think offer a good solution. Clocks, of course, is one. Portico is another. Another is the PKPPN that I mentioned a moment ago. There's also the LOCKS Alliance, and Coriniana from Brazil is a member of the LOCKS Alliance. Some national libraries do high quality preservation, and there are more organizations as well. You can find some of them at the Keepers Registry, and I've given the URL here for the Keepers. So I thought I would give a case study, and I'm not going to use the name of any particular publisher, but this is a kind of description of a publisher. It's a small diamond open access publisher, meaning there are no author fees and basically no real revenue model. It has one biomedical journal. It is managed by the editor-in-chief in his or her academic office. So it's based in a university. And this journal uses the open journal system, but unfortunately the version of OJS that they are using is too old to be included in the PKP preservation network. They are listed in DOAJ, which is good, and they want the DOAJ seal. The DOAJ seal is something that an open access publisher can earn if they meet certain criteria of the DOAJ. And one of those criteria is to be in a good preservation service. This journal also wants to be indexed in PubMed. That's important for any medical journal. And PubMed also requires that a journal participate in a preservation service. So this journal makes the decision to sign an agreement with Clocks, and all of our publishers have signed agreements with us. The costs for this publisher, there's an annual fee of $242 per year. There's also an ingest fee, which is based on the number of articles per year, but the first 100 articles are free. And in this journal, they have less than 100 articles per year, so they have zero ingest fee. There is also a one-time setup fee of $1,500. And the process that is followed is first, Clocks and the publisher have a conversation, usually by email, and Clocks has a crawler that goes around to all of our publishers, and with this publisher, it is agreed that our crawler will come to their site and our crawler will pick up the content, and the publisher on their site needs to give us permission. Once we pick up the content, we then put it into our system for long-term preservation. And I will say a little bit more about our system in another slide. So with that, I am now going to move into focusing on Clocks as a system. We are a market-leading preservation technology using the open source LOCKSS software. LOCKSS is an acronym. It means lots of copies keep stuff safe. And Clocks is an acronym of an acronym. The C means controlled. So we are a controlled LOCKSS implementation. And I'll say a little bit more about our technology later. At this point, we have 42 million journal articles in our system and 200,000 books. This, of course, grows every year. We have 300 publishers who are contributing their content to our system. We have 300 libraries who are supporting our system has global redundancy. We'll talk about, we have community governance, and our support from libraries is voluntary because they recognize the importance of long-term digital preservation. They recognize the important role that libraries play. We are a dark archive, which means that users cannot access our 42 million articles and 200,000 books unless the content will disappear from the web. And if content disappears, then we will make it available through our system. And when we do that, it is always open access. We have a certification as a trusted repository audit certification. We have the highest scores for technology and organizational infrastructure. We can get content either by harvest, which I mentioned earlier, or by file transfer. File transfer, the publisher packages the content. We are focused these days on new content types because the scholarly literature is becoming more diverse and more dynamic. We have a robust succession plan in the unlikely event that Clocks will go out of business. There is a plan so that the content would continue to be preserved. And finally, we have a strong relationship with the Stanford Library. We are independent of the Stanford University. We have a strong relationship. So a few words about our technology. We use the LOCKSS technology. We have 12 copies of the content around the world. And here I show you the organizations that are hosting the content. In North America, there's 4 universities. In Europe, there's 3 universities. In Asia Pacific, there's 2 universities. In Japan, we have had discussions with parties in Latin America over the years, but none of those discussions have resulted in the establishment of a server node in Latin America. I'm hopeful that at some point in the future, Clocks will have a server node. As I said earlier, we are certified as a trusted digital repository with a perfect score for technology. Our chief scientist is a gentleman by the name of David Rosenthal. Here is a link to his blog where he talks about Clocks. We were recertified in November 2018, and at that point received a top score for organizational infrastructure. I said a moment ago that we can get content 2 different ways, either by file transfer or web harvest. Here I give the URLs for guidelines for publishers who want to work with us. In some ways, file transfer is simpler, but Web Harvest has a couple of particularly useful aspects. One is that with long tail publishers, and long tail means small publishers who maybe only have one journal and maybe do not have very much infrastructure, some of those publishers are not really capable of creating a file transfer package. So Web Harvest is really the only way for us to get their content. So Web Harvest is particularly useful then. And also Web Harvest is a better method to pick up dynamic content. File transfer is very static. The content is very static. But if we pick it up through Web Harvest, we can pick up more of the dynamic aspects. As I said, we are a dark archive. In those rare cases that we trigger content, we do it open access. And what a trigger means is when digital content ceases to be available to end users, access must be ensured to support scholarship, and that's when CLOCKS steps in and makes the content available. And here is a link to the content that we have. Saying a bit more about triggers, we have very rigorous rules and practices. We're very careful before we make content available. Our bylaws require that 75% of the board votes in favor of making content available, and no more than 2 board members can vote against the trigger. We have about 25,000 journals in our system. Of those 25,000, only 65 have been triggered. So you can see that it's a very small percentage of journals. However, it's a lot more than 0. So while it's a small number, it's an important number. And these journals, even though the publisher basically gave up on them and took them down from the web, these journals are not unimportant. They receive about 1 million article downloads per year and about 20,000 DOI resolutions per month. We make the triggered journals open access, via CLOCKS, hosted by both Stanford University and the University of Edinburgh. And we assign a Creative Commons license to this content. I want to say a few words about the CLOCKS governance. Our board of directors is completely comprised by libraries and publishers. There's 12 libraries and 12 publishers on the board of directors. They meet several times a year and discuss issues that are important to CLOCKS and make decisions and give me guidance. So we consider that we are in constant close contact with the community. We are funded by publisher fees and contributions from libraries. We are a freestanding nonprofit organization based in the US. But of course, we are a very global organization. We are financially stable, and as I said, we have a strong succession plan. I only have a couple of more slides. Wanted to say a few words about our challenges. Right now, I think our engagement with the Global South is one of our challenges. So being invited to make this presentation is very appropriate and timely. CLOCKS is a service that is valuable for all libraries and publishers and end users in the world. And the Global South is actually underrepresented among CLOCKS libraries and publishers. And we'd like to collaborate with all of you in this meeting and others to try to improve that connection between CLOCKS and another challenge is, constant challenge is that we need support for a sustainable, diverse, and robust digital preservation environment. As I said, we are financially stable, but I never take it for granted that that support will always be there. So we always libraries are working to earn that support. We receive about 1/3 of our funding from global libraries. Our goal is actually 50%. So we would like to improve the level of funding support. Our priorities this year, I've already mentioned increasing awareness in the Global South, also Asia. China, of course, is more and more important, and the Chinese government has announced an investment in scholarly publishing in China, domestic publishing. So we are trying to close relationships in China and elsewhere in Asia. We are always investing in hardware and software to improve the timeliness of preservation. For the past several years, we've been completing our collection by adding large back files of publishers, going back to Volume 1, which in some cases, of course, is 200 years ago or longer, and books. We have 200,000 books, but we need to improve our coverage. This last point here, and it's really the last point that I'm going to make in my talk, is that scholarly publishing is evolving. It's more diverse and it's more dynamic. Nowadays, scholarly publishing is not just journal articles and books. It's also software, video, data sets, databases, interactive scholarly works, which are kind of enhanced ebooks. Also post-publication content like comments and preprints. And it is a challenge for CLOCs and other preservation organizations, first to understand out of all of these additional content types, what should be preserved, what measures up to the level of being part of the permanent scholarly record. If we take data sets, for example, there may be many data sets that qualify for long-term preservation, but there also are many data sets that are provisional, temporary, and do not qualify for long-term preservation. How do we know the difference? Not only that, but also are there norms? And in all of these kinds of content types that I've mentioned here, we don't have the same kind of best practices that are broadly adopted as we do with journals and books. So for a preservation organization like CLOCs, we are dealing with sort of an immature environment in some of these areas, and it makes it hard for us to build economies of scale. All of that said, our goal is to preserve the scholarly record. And defining the boundaries of the scholarly record is something that we need input from the community, libraries, publishers, and users. We need that input, and we also need to work with the community to understand what should be in scope for CLOCs and what is the best way for CLOCs to engage with all of these different concepts. So with that, I'm going to conclude. Our holdings are publicly reported on our website, also in the Keepers Registry. And with that, I would say adios and gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Craig, por tu excelente presentación tan interesante sobre un tema tan relevante como lo es hoy la preservación digital. Hay muchos comentarios y muchas preguntas, por la cual procederé con la primera pregunta de Salvador Montes, que nos consulta acerca de la conservación. Ha sido un tanto complicada para las bibliotecas en América Latina. Ahora, para el futuro, ¿ustedes creen que haya la posibilidad de que el coste baje, o sea, el costo? ¿Cuándo podría ser más la inversión mínima para preservar la colección de una biblioteca de unos 10.000 volúmenes? Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a good question. And I think the question is a little bit different for libraries versus publishers. I think you're asking the question in the context of libraries. And one thing I did not talk about, but I will now, libraries are concerned about preservation in a very broad way. CLOCS is here to address the scholarly record, but the library may be concerned about the preservation of other kinds of materials as well. For example, the library might have an institutional repository that might have digital artifacts from faculty members that are not part of the scholarly record, but are important inside that university, and the library is interested to preserve that kind of content. And the library has a challenge to do that because that content comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes. It's difficult for a library to find economy of scale to preserve the sort of digital artifacts that are created within the university. There are systems that are available. The ones I'm most familiar with are in North America, such as Chronopolis, for example, which comes out of San Diego, or sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the other one that I wanted to remember. And then, you know, in Brazil, there is Coriniana, which you probably have already spoken with them, but it would be worth speaking with.
Muchas gracias, Craig, por tu respuesta. Catalina Soto nos hace otra pregunta. ¿Cuáles son las principales amenazas que atentan contra la preservación digital sobre la información digital? Muchas gracias.
Thank you. That is a great question. And of course, that is a question I think about. I would say the number one threat, from my point of view, is library support. And I don't say that just because I'm speaking to 600 librarians right now. It is the truth that we need libraries to continue to consider digital preservation to be important. Libraries are the number one champions of digital preservation. And you know, the financial support is one thing, and of course that's important. Even more important is the strategic support to digital preservation. Publishers, of course, listen to libraries very closely. Libraries are customers for libraries and authors, for scholarly publishers. So when a library says to a publisher, digital preservation is important, the publisher pays attention. That's the number one threat. A second threat, which is a little bit related, open access publishing could become a threat because libraries do not have to buy subscriptions to open access journals. So because libraries don't have to buy those subscriptions, does it mean that libraries will be less interested in the preservation of those journals? So again, I would appeal to libraries to be concerned also about the preservation of open access journals, even though you don't need to buy subscriptions, that on behalf of your user group of scholars, digital preservation is important, even if you don't have to.
Muchísimas gracias, Craig, por tu respuesta. Ruth Belia nos hace otra pregunta. ¿Por qué cree que el sur global tiene baja representación en CLOCS? ¿Qué estrategia tiene CLOCS para promover la preservación de revistas en Latinoamérica?
Thank you for that question. I think the first is for CLOCS to do a better job of reaching out to Latin America. You know, at any given time, we have a list of priorities, and we need to bring Latin America higher on our priority list. And I believe that as of now, we are moving Latin America higher on our priority list. In former times, a few years ago, as I said, we had Cielo in our system, and we also had support from CAPES, a large Latin American library consortium. And we were very glad to have those relationships. I think the financial difficulties that came to Brazil and other countries in Latin America a few years ago, I think that was a problem for continuing those relationships. The third thing I would mention is establishing a server node in Latin America. I think if we could do that, that would give us a footprint in Latin America. Now, in terms of other reasons, cost, the colleague previously already asked about cost. I think that cost is a barrier. When I was telling you our fees, to be honest, I think $242 a year is a very good fee. And I think zero for ingest, if you have less than 100 articles, is good. But I think the $1,500 setup fee might be a barrier for some publishers. And we are working to try to have more efficiencies at our end in the onboarding of new publishers so that we can reduce that setup fee. If we could reduce that, then I think that might help publishers from Latin America.
Muchas gracias, Craig. Quiero leerte algunos comentarios de algunos asistentes. Santos hace un comentario acerca de que la biblioteca tiene que pensar en la preservación digital a corto plazo, ya que los medios de almacenaje cambian continuamente, al igual que los sistemas de consulta y recuperación. Luego, Luis Emilio también nos hace un comentario que la conservación y preservación es un tema importante tanto para las bibliotecas como para los archivos. Quería hacerte llegar esos dos comentarios y te queremos dar las gracias y mencionar que existen muchísimos otros más comentarios de felicitaciones acerca de tu presentación, de lo interesante que ha sido la temática que has abordado. Así que te queremos dar las gracias por estar con nosotros, por haber participado en este congreso, en la conferencia. Bueno, desde ya, para cerrar estos 3 días de conferencia, quisiera dejar con ustedes a Rodrigo Donoso, director de la Dirección de Servicios de Información y Bibliotecas de la Universidad de Chile, CICIB. La palabra es tuya, Rodrigo.
Muchas gracias, Tania, y también a todos los participantes que aún están conectados. Por supuesto, felicitaciones a los ganadores. Solamente para cerrar, quisiera agradecer la participación de todos ustedes. Nos quedamos para el próximo año con un tremendo compromiso de poder seguir realizando actividades. Yo creo que todos los días hemos aprendido mucho, hemos conocido nuevos colegas, hemos interactuado a través de las plataformas que dispusimos para poder contactarnos. Así que como equipo de CICIB le damos muchas gracias, estamos muy contentos por todo el trabajo desarrollado y también por haber contado con ustedes durante estos 3 días de jornada y también muchos de ustedes por haber participado de más de 17 talleres que tuvimos durante las jornadas de la tarde durante estos 3 días. Finalmente, dejarlos invitados para el próximo año. Esperamos volver a realizar la 8ª versión de este Congreso de Bibliotecas Universitarias y Especializadas, ya sea online o sea presencial, pero sin duda vamos a tener un nuevo congreso donde poder invitarlos y donde poder volver a reencontrarnos. Muchas gracias a todos. Dejo con Tania para el cierre final del evento. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Rodrigo, por tus palabras. También queremos dar las gracias a todos los asistentes durante esta convocatoria. Han habido muchos asistentes, así que les queremos agradecer la gran audiencia que hemos tenido, el gran interés en este 7º Congreso de Bibliotecas Universitarias y Especializadas, por su asistencia y participación. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias por todas las felicitaciones, por todos los comentarios que nos han hecho llegar. Dependiendo de donde sea, les deseo buenas tardes, buenas mañanas o buenas noches. Así que muchas gracias por su asistencia Nos vemos para el próximo año.